curious from your perspective how other people appear to you when you're seeing from conscious awareness, and what changes about your perception of them. So not just their states or their field or their psyche, but also just your, do they look like different people to you than they do when you're just looking at them from ego?
Typically, they just look like even bigger idiots.
Perfect.
But then...
So ego never goes away.
But then when I look at myself from consciousness, I'm just as big an idiot.
It's a similar critique.
Yeah.
And that's the intro to conscious holding.
Yeah. It's so hard to talk about this stuff, obviously. The basis of all this work is discerning consciousness from not. And obviously it's kind of the age-old question or problem that, you can only point at it. You can't really display it, right? And most people think of consciousness, like that word gets used typically in a way where it's synonymous with just like being awake as opposed to asleep, like literally. And that's obviously not what we're talking about right now with regard to consciousness. So I tend to use the words ego aware, meaning unconscious, and consciously aware is being conscious. And when you add consciousness to awareness, then there's various things: essence, presence, a sense of beingness, a sense of ontological reality. There's various ways it gets experienced, and there's that thing where it's like with light. We can describe light. We can try to describe our experience of all the things that light can do, and we can contrast it with the experience of darkness. So if you talk about the ego, how the ego is affected by consciousness, the ego it can be affected in various ways. It can bring a threat to the ego because it starts to destructure it. But generally speaking, our bodies, our physical bodies, emotional bodies, mental bodies, are the idea is that the truth is they exist in consciousness, in this field, if you will, of consciousness. That's the truth. And to exist in that field of consciousness is to exist in a benevolent field. There's a recognition that you cannot be separated from that field. You are one and the same with that field, and it gets registered by various parts of our ego as goodness, as safety, as love, as inclusion. When there's a separation or a cutoff from that, then we feel separate, alone, forsaken, abandoned. And then, of course, the big spiritual idea is that that's not true, but we can experience that. And that ultimately that cutoff that we're experiencing happens via our own psyche. That even if all the humans in the world got together and ganged up on you and said, "You're out, we don't want you, we don't like you, you're terrible," the general idea is that if the person stayed in touch with the truth, they'd just be able to withstand that and know that, no, indeed, that person can't be separated out from consciousness. So no matter how kind of severe the circumstance is, the idea is that the truth is we're inseparable from that that field of consciousness. So obviously it doesn't take a whole lot for us to be convinced that indeed we are separate from it, and then we make a thing happen in our psyche. And as I've said before, it's kind of analogous to closing your eyes. You can shut your eyes and block out the light. So that's all talking about it in relation to the ego experience. It gets much tougher to try to talk about, well, but what is the direct experience of consciousness? And how do you know when you're being conscious versus just ego aware? Because you can have an experience of what feels like safety or love or inclusion, and that can just be an ego experience. So trying to discern one from the other is difficult to talk about because, we only have these ego words. The general idea is that it's the ego realm. Thoughts, for example, exist within the ego realm, and the spiritual viewpoint is that there is something beyond the ego realm that words and physical senses, etc., can't see, can't touch, can't encompass. So by sort of innately, consciousness is ultimately indescribable or undefinable. But again, we can point to it and we can talk about how we can notice it. If you try to put it in terms of vibration, there's a distinctly different vibration to consciousness than to the vibrations of the psyche. That's one way that it gets talked about a lot. It's a more subtle vibration. And I don't just mean subtle energy. I mean, it's more subtle than subtle energy. So the chakra realm, for example, the subtle energetic realm, that's still part of the ego realm. The conscious realm vibrates at a much higher frequency than the subtle, and it's a more subtle energy. So again, the truth is everything is infused with consciousness. Gets into this weird quantum situation because it's like, wait, I thought you could just close your eyes and block out light, and that was analogous to consciousness, and our psyches have the ability to block out consciousness. But if consciousness actually can penetrate anything, how can we block it out? So the analogy starts to fall apart. Can I hear what you're...
Yeah, totally. I was just thinking about trying to make that analogy work for the fact that it's both within and without, because the truth is that they're both the same. So to close your eyes to it is because you talk about closing your eyes to the sun, and you can close your eyes to the sun, but the sun's still there. You can black it out to a more extreme degree, but it doesn't remove knowledge of it. And you could live in a cave long enough that you forget what the sun is, but the sun's still there. So there's a timeless nature to it that exists outside of direct experience, but it's always there. But as far as the vibration thing, I hadn't thought about the higher frequency part. And I think that's an interesting, because if you think about the sun has a lot of different frequencies of energy coming from it too. And there are ultraviolet rays that you can't perceive, but are at a higher energy, or higher frequency, that permeate more than other types of light energy, right? So you have the visible spectrum of light, and you have things beyond that being generated by the sun. As far as the felt sense of it, because I definitely appreciate the challenge of trying to describe it, and I appreciated that you said right off the bat that, it's subtle, but it's not subtle energy. And I think it's the first time we talked about subtle energy being still part of the ego realm and kind of distinguishing something about the internal organs of perception versus something that's both internal and external, that when you sense conscious awareness, it's coming seemingly from the outside in a way, because you become a conduit for it rather than a generator of it or something powered by it. It's like channeling in a way. And I think for me, the experience of it is literally indescribable for a long time. And the experience of it is too vast to speak from. That there is this feeling, I think it gets talked about in the sense of planes sometimes. Planes. And that there's this plane that opens up that is unlike any of the lower planes that you've felt or lived in. And there's definitely a sense of truth that feels so real, it's like difficult to relate to another person to the point of being able to talk to them while experiencing it.
What's the difference between conscious holding and mindfulness? And the way I would answer that is ultimately nothing. When someone's in a mindful state, they are consciously holding whatever they are attending to. So the state of mindfulness is conscious mind realization that can happen, that is defined as a person becoming consciously aware as the conscious mind. And so the state of mindfulness is what that experience is when one is attending from their conscious mind consciously. I think the word gets used in various ways by people. It'll be sort of described like it's a relaxation exercise, or like if from a cognitive ego place, you say, okay, I'm being mindful right now because I'm paying attention, or I'm paying attention to my breathing or something, then you're being mindful. And I don't think that's accurate. I think you're being ego aware, which is actually very, very different than being mindful. Because to be mindful is to be conscious, which is different, again, than just being ego aware. And the experience that happens via the conscious mind, the natural, innate thing that happens, is that the conscious mind recognizes or lives in that conscious field that holds everything, that mirrors everything, that is present with everything. So the practice of conscious holding, for example, or if we start with witnessing, right? In the way that I talk about it, initially there's witnessing, which is to consciously look at something versus to just look from an ego organ, if you will. Right? We have all these ego organs. We can be emotionally aware, we can be mentally aware. Ego realm organs. You can talk about which chakra are you really attending with. But when you look at something, so to speak, with consciousness, then you innately are witnessing versus observing, versus just looking at. And to witness, again, it brings a different quality. To witness is to consciously look at. There's a relational aspect to that. There's presence. Like the term gets used to bear witness. And the reason that word bear is used is that it is not, to witness is not a passive thing, right?
No, I was just thinking that there's an interaction. It's not seeing it as an object. You can say it's an object in the field, but to witness that object is to acknowledge something in it and what's going on beyond yourself versus that object.
And the general idea that I think is a profound thing, when you start to, one way to really start to be able to discern consciousness from ego activity, when you notice what you have trouble bearing witness to, what you have trouble being conscious of, what you have trouble consciously holding, right? The experience that comes when we don't want to look at something, right? To watch that George Floyd video, it's hard to watch. There's a tendency to want to look away, to stop it, to watch, to watch suffering of any kind. The tendency is to look away, as if the looking away would stop it, and or as if the looking at it causes it or perpetuates it. And that fundamental distinction really keeps humanity stuck. We look away from that which we don't want. We look away from that which scares us. We look away from that which seems too tempting. We look away from that which suggests something about ourselves that we don't want to be so.
So witnessing is acknowledging the timelessness of what's going on in the moment.
Yeah, kind of in that same way, the timelessness and the existence of it, if you will, right? It's like we're all going around. It's like if you think of consciousness is creation, right? Consciousness. If the idea is that it's consciousness that creates the space for everything to happen. Like that idea of if consciousness is light and awareness is space and the ego is matter, and that idea of that with the Big Bang, when the Big Bang happened, space was actually created. There's that weird thing where there was space, and then this little ball of matter exploded and shot all these particles out into the pre-existing space, which is a different concept than there wasn't even space. And the expansion that occurs with a Big Bang is actually creating space as it expands. And so when you think of it that way, that our conscious minds, that consciousness exists, but then we're in this ego realm, ego matrix experience, and then in the same way that the sun exists, the sun is shining its light, and the sun is always shining its light. And even if you go into a building, close all the windows or close all the blinds, and you make it dark in there, like you were saying a little bit ago, the truth is the sun's still out there, and there can be a knowing that the sun didn't stop shining, but you're experiencing a dark room. And then you can turn a light on in that room, or you can bring a flashlight, or, and now you can light up that room. And, the general idea would be, whether you're using a flashlight or a candle or a lamp, that light that you're now lighting that room up is really sunlight. It's just been converted, or run through certain mediums. But the idea is that it's light, and that light is ultimately sunlight. So if you think of consciousness the same way, we have this conscious mind that is capable of shining light. If you think of it that way, that it's a torch or it's a lantern. And we as human beings are living in this ego realm, in these dimensions of the psyche that are dark. So we've ventured into, this realm, this ego realm, and it's dark, but we have the potential to light it up with our conscious mind. And when we do that, when we shine our light, when we look with consciousness, we're creating the space for things to happen that don't happen when you're not shining that light. So it's a profound thing. And again, the analogy of a lantern or something. Certainly there's changes when you turn a light on in a room, but when you bring consciousness to a dimension and illuminate that dimension, it's much more profound than just flipping a light switch and being able to see in there now. There's a lot of things that happen differently. So again, this idea of witnessing, holding, containing, mirroring, contacting, those words are these sort of different experiences of what that consciousness does and how it can interact with ego experience. To notice when you have trouble being conscious, when you want to look away, when you want to shut down, when you want to escape, when you want to deny, you want to repress. You're wanting it to not be so. You're wanting it to not exist. We want to live in a world that doesn't include that. We don't want to live in a world that includes death. We don't want to live in a world that includes suffering, or that includes abuse, or includes tragedy. We wish it was different, and this idea that we as humans can't really face reality, right? That was a big philosophical turn, that happened at a certain point in history, where philosophers were recognizing humans can't really deal with themselves, with life, with reality. To a massive degree, we block. We just block it out. We have to block it out. We can't face how vulnerable we actually are. We can't face, how complex life really is. Our egos are set up so that we have these defenses that specifically keep us from seeing the truth. Narcissism, that we project an aspect of our psyche onto the world so as to not recognize the world as it is. And this process of coming out of the narcissistic stance in any given organ of perception. To come out of the narcissistic stance is to allow and recognize the otherness of what it is that you are being aware of. Right? So there's these levels of differentiation. Because it gets confusing, because I'm saying there's this oneness. Consciousness is indivisible. So the truth is, it's all this one thing, but there's these levels of differentiation. So, in the same way that if you use the idea of H2O, and that H2O, for example, can be in a gas state or a liquid state or a solid state. And if we say there's lots and lots of different levels like that, and if you say, okay, so at the gross physical level, there is separateness, right? There is a difference between two different physical objects, and you can have them separate. They can be separated, by space. And obviously we can break it down further and further and try to look at separate electrons, etc. But so what I'm getting at is, when you think about your physical body, meaning, where your physical body ends and where world begins for you, it's terrifying to really perceive world, meaning physical objects that are actually out beyond your own body, as separate physically. We have this conceptual knowledge that, well, yeah, of course, that chair that's over there across the room, that's not part of my body. We have a conceptual understanding, but to really, in the present moment, in present time, in a very immediate way, to perceive the physical world around you and let it indeed be separate, as opposed to have your first chakra, for example, expand in a way that you're just including the physical objects around you in your first chakra field. That's a narcissistic state. If you expand your chakra, I know I'm kind of jumping all over here, but if you expand your chakra, which is easy to do, you can just sort of expand it out to where now you're looking through a lens that has everything actually as an extension of yourself. And it protects our psyche in a similar kind of way that if you put sunglasses on, you're now seeing everything through that lens, and now the light is not as bright, and so you're protected. And it's not like, the world actually just got darker. It's that you put these sunglasses on, and so it all looks darker to you. And now you're more, you're shielded. We are shielding our minds from the actual world, from the actual truth, from the actual other, physically, emotionally, mentally. We can't take it. It's too much. It's too bright. It's too alive. There's too much love. There's too much darkness. There's too much complexity. Our minds can't take it. And personal growth, healing, awakening involves these processes that enable us, little by little, to become more capable of tolerating reality.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.